Hello and welcome to the online ministry of New Westminster Christian Reformed Church. We hope that today's message will be a word of encouragement for you from our Lord Jesus Christ. If you would like to contact our church or our pastors, please visit our website at nwcrc.ca. May God bless you.
Once again, good morning, everyone. It is my privilege to open God's Word with you this morning as we continue in the stories of Genesis. Today we arrive at chapter 23 and read the story of the death of Sarah. Perhaps not the most fitting text for a joyous morning like today as we witness baptisms and testimonies, but my prayer is that you'll see how this story is a wonderful testimony to the hope that we have in God that's symbolized in the sacrament of baptism. Is my mic kind of going back on and off? Okay, let's try it just a little bit more, and otherwise I'll use this. So let's turn to Genesis 23, and I have asked Peter to read this passage for us. Thank you, Peter.
Genesis 23. Sarah lived to be 127 years old. She died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abram went to mourn for Sarah and to weep over her. Then Abraham rose from beside his dead wife and spoke to the Hittites. He said, "I am a foreigner and stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site here so that I can bury my dead." The Hittites replied to Abraham, "Sir, listen to us. You are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will refuse you his tomb for burying your dead." Then Abraham rose and bowed down before the people of the land, the Hittites. He said to them, "If you are willing to let me bury my dead, then listen to me and intercede with Ephron, son of Sohar, on my behalf, so he will sell me the cave of Machpelah, which belongs to him and is at the end of his field. Ask him to sell it to me for the full price as a burial site among you." Ephron, the Hittite, was sitting among the people, and he replied to Abraham in the hearing of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of the city. "No, my lord," he said, "listen to me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the presence of my people. Bury your dead." Again, Abraham bowed down before the people of the land, and he said to Ephron in their hearing, "Listen to me. If you will, I will pay the price of the field. Accept it for me so I can bury my dead there." Ephron answered Abraham, "Listen to me, my lord. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver. But what is that between you and me? Bury your dead." Abraham agreed to Ephron's terms and weighed out for him the price he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weight current among the merchants. So Ephron's field in Machpelah near Mamre, both the field and the cave in it, and all the trees within the borders of that field, was deeded to Abraham as his property in the presence of all of the Hittites who had come to the gate of the city. Afterwards, Abraham buried his wife, Sarah, in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. So the field and the cave in it were deeded to Abraham by the Hittites as a burial site. May the Lord bless our reading.
Thank you, Peter, for reading God's word for us. There are significant moments in one's life. Obviously, the day that you were born, your birthday, the day of your baptism, if you're baptized, is certainly a special day. Each year, I try to write a card or do something special for my kids on their baptism anniversary with the hope that it will remain a special day for them and they will remember the great work of God that He has done in their lives. Wedding day, if you're married, the day you become parents or grandparents, 95th birthday, if God grants you that special blessing. And I'm sure there are many, many other wonderful milestones in life. And then for all of us comes the day of our funeral. Before coming to New West, I have rarely been to a funeral service. The church that I was part of was a very young church, and being an immigrant church, many of our parents and grandparents were in Korea, so I personally maybe only 4 or 5 times in my whole life until then have been to a funeral service. After coming to New West, if my calendar is correct, I have been to 42 funeral services and memorial services. And I have learned what a special moment that is. When our loved ones die, we enter into a space that is, of course, filled with sadness and pain, but also something sacred. The nearness of God, if I can put it that way. That space is a time and a moment when heaven and earth meet. Well, today we read the first account of a funeral in the Bible. And again, we enter into that sacred space where heaven and earth meet. But did you notice that in our reading, only a few verses actually talk about Sarah? Only at the beginning and at the end. In the beginning, it says Sarah died. At the very end, it says she was buried. Everything in between is about Abraham purchasing the land to bury his wife. So this morning, as we consider this chapter, I want us to reflect on 3 things. First is Sarah's death, and then second is Abraham's purchase of the land, and third would be his faith in God. So Sarah's death, Abraham's purchase of the land, and his faith. So first, Sarah's death. Last summer, Lynn and I celebrated 15th wedding anniversary. And 15 years for us seems like a long time. But then I know some of you are celebrating 50, 60 years of marriage, and you'll say, "Oh, June, you haven't experienced anything yet." Well, when Sarah died, Abraham and Sarah had been married for more than 100 years. So for those who have been married for 50, 60 years, Abraham and Sarah will tell you, you don't know anything yet. And we know that those 100 years were not all easy and peaceful. They had to move from one place to another. They had to leave the comforts of their families and friends And oftentimes they found themselves in difficult and dangerous situations. But through it all, Sarah had been Abraham's soulmate, closest friend, and lifelong partner in their epic adventure together. Sarah was there at every significant moment of Abraham's life. When God first came to Abraham and told him this unbelievable promise that God will make him into a great nation, I'm sure Abraham and Sarah talked about that for days and nights. At one point, when God said to Abraham, "All the land you see, I will give to you and to your offspring forever." Imagine Abraham and Sarah perhaps sitting on a hillside, looking over the land, and then looking at one another, saying, "God will give us this land." And then God gave them new names: Abram to Abraham, Sarai to Sarah. And I think, imagine with me how awkward it would have been for a while for them to call each other with their new names. And as we saw last week, the offering of Isaac. See, that story in Genesis doesn't mention Sarah. So I always wonder if Sarah knew what happened. If I were Abraham on that way back from the mountain, I would have told Isaac, "Let's not tell Mom." Well, I'm sure Sarah eventually found out, and for her it would have been another moment of realizing how God is working for them and is preparing for them the way. And now, today, in our chapter, Sarah, Abraham's princess, that's what the name Sarah means, princess. Abraham's princess, his lifelong partner, his soulmate for over a century, dies. In verse 2 we read, "She died at Kiriath Arba," that's in Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep over her, of course. The death of a loved one, as I said, brings us into this space that is so sacred. And no doubt, Sarah's death made Abraham reflect on his life, on God's call that he and Sarah had received together, God's promise, and all the journey that they were on together. And he must have realized how he was still, as he says in verse 4, was a foreigner and a stranger in the land. See, they are in Canaan, right? The narrator of Genesis makes sure that we see that Sarah died in the land of Canaan, the promised land. It's at the beginning of the chapter, at the end of the chapter. Abraham is in the land that God has promised him, but he doesn't own a piece of land where he can bury his wife. I know that many of our seniors wisely have already made the arrangements as to where they will be buried and all the other arrangements. It seems like it wasn't the case for Abraham. When my grandmother passed away now more than 10 years ago at Royal Columbian Hospital, I was in a similar situation. She died quite unexpectedly, and I was not ready. And I was the person who had to look after all the matters related to the funeral and everything. My parents and all my uncles and aunties were not here. And I remember how My grandmother passed away at maybe like 4 a.m. in the morning, and by 9 a.m. I was at a funeral home choosing a coffin for her and making all the other arrangements. It was a rather difficult experience. And maybe it was for Abraham too. Throughout his life, he has been following this promise of God for the land, for a people, a nation. And he is here now, Sarah's dead, and he doesn't have a land to bury her. But then I believe God reminded Abraham of all the promises that he had made over the years. In chapter 12, God promised, "To your offspring I will give this land." In chapter 13, "Look around from where you are to the north and south, to the east and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever." And then again in chapter 15, "To your descendants I give you this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates." And then in chapter 17, "The whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you." These promises have not yet come true, but instead of giving it up, or instead of not trusting in his promise anymore, Abraham decides to evermore trust in the promise, and he decides to buy a plot of land at the heart of God's promised land of Canaan, Hebron, to bury Sarah there. So now we look at Abraham's purchase of the land. Verse 3 and 4. "Then, after all the mourning and weeping, Abraham rose from beside his dead wife and spoke to the Hittites." Hittites were the people in the land, the majority of people at the time. He said, "I am a foreigner and a stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site for my wife so I can bury my dead." Well, he says it right there. I'm a foreigner and a stranger. That's a technical term. I'm an alien. I'm a resident alien. Well, you have welcomed me. You let me live here, but I actually have no right, no legal claim to the land. So let me now purchase a part of your land as a burial site for my wife. That is Abraham's way of saying, I will continue to trust in God's promise, and I will do what I can today to claim it now, to claim that promise. About this, one of the Old Testament theologians by the name of Walter Brueggemann says in a powerful way, the legal action of the purchasing of the land is a full investment in God's promise against the present circumstance. And to Abraham the Hittites answer in verse 6, "Sir, listen to us. You are a mighty prince among us." That's a way of showing respect to Abraham, even though he was a foreigner in the land. "Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will refuse you his tomb for burying your dead." Now, you might read this and all the following conversations and think, what a wonderful people we have here. Every new conversation is more gracious than before. It just becomes more and more gracious and courteous. Or buy the land. No, you can have it. No, I pay for it. No, just take it. But when we look at these conversations a little more carefully, what sounds very generous isn't actually what Abraham was asking, right? bury your dead in one of our tombs is not the same as, yes, we'll sell you the land to you. And many commentators notice that this is how a business conversation begins in that culture. In the Middle East, you don't just say, okay, here's the land, you can buy this for this much price. No. There is this art of conversation almost that is not so direct, that saves your face. We'll see that as we continue. And Abraham knows that. He knows that culture. He knows how to conduct that conversation. So he continues to say, if you're willing to let me bury my dead, then listen to me and intercede with Ephron, son of Zohar, on my behalf, so he will sell me the cave of Machpelah, which belongs to him and is at the end of his field. So Abraham knows fully well that it's not really the case that they are saying, but Abraham is fully aware of what's happening in the conversation, and he's following the protocol, and he says, I'd like to do this business with you, with Ephron, to buy his cave at the end of his field. So then Ephron appears, and he says in verse 11, no, my Lord, listen to me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that's in it. I give it to you in the presence of my people. Bury your dead. Again, it sounds very generous, but if you look carefully, Ephron is bringing up something new here. He's suggesting something new. That is, Abraham only wanted to purchase the cave, but now Ephron is saying, I'll give you the field and the cave in it. Meaning, if you want to buy the cave, you'll have to buy the field. And how do we know that? Well, that's exactly what Abraham agrees to. He gets what Ephron is saying. So he replies in verse 13, listen to me if you will. I will pay the price for the field. Accept it from me so I can bury my dead there. And then Ephron answers in verse 15, listen to me, my Lord. The land, the field is worth 400 shekels of silver. But what's that between you and me? Bury your dead. Okay, so what is he really saying? Is he really saying it's 400 shekels, but I'll give it to you? Is that what he's saying? No, he's naming the price for the field. Just out of curiosity, who here comes from a culture that speaks this way in a very indirect way, with lots of implications? Do you want to raise your hands? Yes, lots of Asian friends. Koreans too. We often speak this way. Who comes from a culture that's more direct? Yes. The joy of pastoring a multicultural congregation. But certainly it was the culture of the Middle East. Ephron, in this very subtle way, names a price. But the problem is, this is way too expensive. The 400 shekels that Ephron is suggesting is way too high for the value of the land. We don't know for sure exactly how much is 400 shekels of silver at this time, but virtually all commentators agree that this is an extremely high price. Now, is Ephron such a bad person, wanting to take advantage of Abraham when he is vulnerable, when his wife has just died? Well, maybe, but maybe not. You know, it's just how you do business in that culture. Well, to this day, in certain parts of the world, when you go there, you'll be a fool to pay the full price that was initially suggested. So Ephron, maybe when he say 400 shekels, the expectation was for Abraham to say, no, 100 or 200. And they would eventually land together on, I don't know, maybe 250, 300. That may have been the expectation. But what does Abraham do? In verse 16, Abraham, right away, without further negotiation, agrees to Ephron's terms and weighed out for him the price he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weight current among the merchants. So do you see what's happening here? Abraham is determined to buy this land to bury his wife. Doesn't matter if Ephron is trying to sell him the whole land. It doesn't matter if Ephron is trying to sell him at a very, very high price. He is willing to pay the price to ensure that this will really become his land, and no one in the future, even in the generations to come, would not be able to dispute over the land, saying, Abraham didn't pay fair amount for the land. Because of his overpayment, no one can deny Abraham's possession of this land. And see all these almost business and commercial languages that we see. Abraham pays exactly 400 shekels of silver, weighed according to the commonly used weight system of the day, in the presence of all these witnesses at the gate of the city. So it's done. He could have taken the offer of the Hittites and buried Sarah in one of their tombs. He could have insisted that he only needed the cave. He could have negotiated a better deal for the land, but he didn't. Why? Because he had faith. Abraham had faith in God's promise. That's our third point. God has told Abraham, as we have read, lift up your eyes, look out as far as you can see, walk from north to the south, to the east to the west, as far as you can see and reach, it will all be yours. All the land that you can see and reach, I give it to you. What an amazing promise it was. But until now, he has not possessed any piece of the land. He was a foreigner, he was a stranger in the land. But now, he owns this one field, one cave that he bought. Why? Because he believed that God will one day fulfill his promise and give him and his descendants the land, even though he couldn't see it just yet. And in the rest of the Genesis story, we see what a gift this field and this cave becomes to the offspring of Abraham. In verse 25, we read, Abraham breathed his last breath and died at a good old age. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre, in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite, the field Abraham had bought from the Hittites. And then toward the end of the book of Genesis, in chapter 49, we read, this is Jacob now saying to his sons, bury me with my fathers in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite, the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre in Canaan, which Abraham bought along with the field as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite. There, Abraham and his wife Sarah were buried. There, Isaac and his wife Rebekah were buried. And there I buried Leah. The field and the cave in it were bought from the Hittites. And then in the last chapter of Genesis, chapter 50, we read, So Jacob's sons did as he had commanded them. They carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave in the field of Machpelah, near Mamre, which Abraham had bought along the field as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite. This cave becomes the anchor of hope as the children and children's children of Abraham continue to wait and hope in the promise of God. In the New Testament, in the book of Hebrews, these are the words we read about Abraham and Sarah and so many more forefathers of our faith. Hebrews 11, verse 13 to 15. All these people, including Abraham and Sarah, were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, for Abraham that would be Ur or Chaldea, if they had been thinking of the country that they had left, they would have returned. They would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, God of Abraham, God of Isaac and Jacob. For he has prepared a city for them. Abraham was captivated by the hope in God's promise, and that hope shaped how he lived his day. That hope enabled him to make the decision to buy the land. That hope made Abraham to walk every step of his life, believing that God has prepared for him a better country, a heavenly one. In the Old Testament, prophet Zechariah speaks of God's people as prisoners of hope. Prisoners of hope. That is who we are. We are prisoners of hope. We cannot escape from the hope that God gives us. We are bound and chained by the hope that God gives us. And that's what shapes our life, our decisions, our spendings today. People of God, as it was with Abraham, times of trouble, times of disappointment, even times of death, become times for us to declare our hope in God's promise. Declare by faith that we are the heirs of God's promise. And like Abraham, by faith, we act on our promise, and we act on the promises of God today. Even when we cannot see, we act on the hope we have. We buy the land. We make deliberate choices because we have faith. And God is not ashamed to be called our God, for he has prepared a heavenly city for us. In the name of the Father, Son, the Spirit, together we say,